Hi everyone, I'm Tony Masilis, Chief Content Officer of GZERO Media, and as the 76th UN General Assembly gets underway here in New York City, the world is facing converging crises: pandemic response and recovery, climate change, and widening inequality, of course, would all top that list. And we're going to take a look at the role the private sector can and should play globally. John Frank is Vice President for UN Affairs at Microsoft, happens to be our content partner for the Global Stage series. And John, good to see you.
Great to see you, Tony.
Yeah, so tell me, what exactly is a Vice President for UN Affairs?
Well, we've been working on a lot of big issues that we found are global. The problems are global and the solutions are multilateral as well as global. And so we created a new group for the UN Affairs and international organizations. We've set up this office here in New York City, close to the UN, and we've built out a team that we want to engage more deeply in these multilateral processes. Because whether it's cybersecurity, public health, or climate, the public sector has significant things to contribute, and we'd like to be part of the process.
You know, over the past couple of years, we've heard a lot from both Secretary General Antonio Guterres and other heads of multilateral organizations like Christine Lagarde about this very thing, the importance of bringing private sector to the table. But can you give me a more specific sense of what that looks like? What exactly, what kind of contribution are they looking for from a company like Microsoft?
Sure. And going back to those three topics I just mentioned, with COVID, certainly Microsoft was able to work, and we're still working very deeply with WHO, on trying to bring data science and computer science to the vast amounts of data that are available to help manage response to pandemics and pandemic control. We also work with Federal Express on vaccine distribution, providing them the data science and computer science to help them on that mission. On cybersecurity, we have so much more experience. Governments call them citizens, we call them customers. And we've got a lot of customers around the world, and we know their experience, and we know the risks that they face. And so on cybersecurity, we bring a different perspective about the needs to responsibly disclose vulnerabilities so they can be patched, and to limit the kinds of actions that nation states undertake. On that third topic on climate, we're all in this together, right? The challenges of climate control and decarbonizing our economy are going to fall to the private sector, whether it's a regulation or government partnership or industry initiative. And we believe that we all need to work together to learn together. There's a huge challenge, but the private sector in particular is going to be the ones who's going to be reducing the output.
Now, in terms of your day-to-day working with the UN, how do you interact with permanent reps and delegates, and what kinds of conversations do you have?
I've been very pleasantly, not surprised, but just generally pleased with the warm reception that I've received personally, and our team. And people want us to talk substance. And so whether it's the African group of ambassadors or the least developed countries group of ambassadors, or the EU ambassadors, we have topics to talk about, and they want to know our thoughts. They want us to listen to them and learn from them, which is very important. But it's been good. One of the collaborations we've done this year is we've tried to bring together with the International Peace Institute, the IPI, a diverse set of stakeholders to have some roundtable discussions on different topics to try to elaborate the Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation. And I think that's been kind of an example of where we can bring different voices to the table that can help take the ideas to the next level of thought and detail.
Speaking of digital, it's kind of referred to as SDG 0 in a way, digital equity, and it's pervasive through all of the SDGs, even though it's not an individual one in and of itself. And it's something that in the Secretary General's Common Agenda, he actually makes a big point to say we need to bridge this digital divide. Talk a little bit about the importance of that and what specifically you've been working on around that.
Absolutely. And whether you call it zero or just it's foundational to so many of the SDGs, this past year and a half have demonstrated that those with digital capabilities, you and me, we've been able to carry on our work and our lives with some degree of normality. But people who aren't connected are really left behind. And so there's been greater attention and focus to the digital divide. And so going back to that example I gave of with the International Peace Institute, a series of roundtables to define what does it mean, the digital divide. And I think the views expressed can be summarized as we need a human-centered definition. So we need to measure adoption and usage and the equity of that, as well as the public services that are being provided, education and healthcare. And we need to take a step back from the way we've been doing it. In management, we say, you do what you measure. And whether it's Rwanda or the United States, we've been looking at maps of coverage, and they show broad coverage. But what we've learned is that depending on purchasing power, there may be coverage, but if people can't afford it, they can't adopt it. So we need to develop measurements around affordability to the purchasing power of the population, as an example. We don't really measure well the quality of usage by gender. In some countries, anecdotally, we believe there's a great disparity. And similarly, how do we measure the quality of services being delivered? Because that's the creation of value for society is the healthcare, the education, and other public services that are delivered.
It's funny, I'm thinking about even here in the United States as vaccine was rolled out, so much of it was online in terms of registering to get vaccinated, to find out where you can go to get an appointment. And there were people who didn't know how to access that information, elderly people maybe who didn't, who aren't quite as skilled with smartphones or the computer, or people who just didn't have internet access. It makes me think, this issue is really kind of three-pronged, right? There's broadband and having actual internet access, but then there's devices and skills.
Absolutely.
So how do you approach that sort of in its totality, I guess?
I think you obviously need all three. And, one of the things, like here in the United States, one of the projects we've undertaken is measuring actual broadband adoption. And, you look at the maps and it's, say, 30 million people aren't covered. But when you start measuring actual usage, and so whether you're measuring downloads of Windows updates, what speed people are downloading at, or Netflix or other services, you come up with a much bigger number. And it's about a third of the country that doesn't really have full advantage of broadband speed. And so I think it's important to recognize that. But as you say, digital skills are hugely important in the United States, but around the world. I mean, people go online for the first time. They need just some, how do we do it? One of the programs we've had this year is we set a goal of getting basic digital skills to 25 million people around the world through our LinkedIn platforms and other tools. And we're now at about 40 million people that have taken advantage of that. So the nice thing about it is these services are scalable at very low marginal cost. And so there are good solutions available, but it is important to remember digital skills are key.
The President's infrastructure plan has about $65 billion earmarked for broadband and for expanding internet access. I guess my question would be, how do you incentivize or ensure that telecoms aren't just expanding access in places that already have it, or providing better services to wealthier communities at the expense of disadvantaged communities?
Yeah, and I think I'm no expert on the U.S., and some of my colleagues can go much deeper, but again, we need qualitative measurements, and we need to be looking at affordability. I don't think that we do enough to create alternative solutions that are affordable, because it's internet access in the United States is very expensive, and so our studies say that you have to get to $100,000 of income before a household will feel free to use as much internet as they want, and that's a pretty high threshold. So I think we need to focus on the affordability, the purchasing power, and how do we keep costs lower?
So another digital issue that was mentioned in the common agenda, and I was not surprised to see it, but maybe pleased that Antonio Guterres called it out. He called it an infodemic, obviously talking about the proliferation of disinformation. Did it surprise you that he mentioned that specifically?
Well, I think it is such an important issue, and I hear it from government officials in the United States and Europe and around the world, that if we can't have a more common set of facts, it's harder to hold societies together. And the tech sector, we love to create technologies that are going to change the world, but we really ought to, it's not just how we aspire that they be used. We're responsible for how they're actually used in practice. And we need to work on this challenge. I participated in an international group, a transatlantic working group on freedom of expression and content moderation. And it became so clear that, very diverse views in this room of esteemed experts, but freedom of expression has to be at the core. You can't take that away. But looking for solutions, it's challenging, and we're seeing more experimentation around the world. But I think one area we all could agree on is greater transparency from social media providers about their algorithms, and it's one thing to promote customer engagement, it's another thing to promote disinformation and radicalization of disinformation. So we need to work on this system, and some companies are doing better jobs than others, but this is a very big challenge.
And finally, as I mentioned, we're having this conversation as the 76th General Assembly gets underway, sadly, largely virtual again, it seems, although there will be a few heads of state here over the course of the next couple of weeks. What are you hoping comes out of this? And, these gatherings tend to be a lot of global cooperation, but, what's the punchline? What do you think kind of is the most urgent need right now?
The world has a lot of big challenges right now, but the public health challenge and the climate challenge, I think, have to top the list. Last Friday, Secretary General Guterres introduced his program called A Common Agenda, which is really a roadmap for how we rebuild, as he says, solidarity, but also how we make the multilateral system stronger, more inclusive, with the UN at its center. And I think that debate is really foundational to how we're going to address these bigger challenges. One of the interesting points I just want to call out is, I think he expressed it as, we measure GDP by economic productivity, but we don't subtract out the externality cost of pollution and things. And I think that's really a very interesting idea. And I think it points to something that we've recognized in our own efforts, which is we need a common international standard and system for measuring carbon production, and a ledger system, so that we can look back to our supply chain, and people we supply can look to us, so they can actually measure the carbon. And then at a national government, it has to be able to roll up to what's actually happened, because the scientific studies of when we go into the atmosphere, there's a lot more carbon there than the current estimates or guesstimates that we're making on Earth.
Yeah, it's funny, when you look at sort of economic indicators of recovery, GDP certainly being one of them in wealthier nations right now, it doesn't say much about what's actually happening on the ground in terms of growing inequality, right? Women being left behind in the workforce over the course of this pandemic. To what extent does the private sector have a role in that kind of recovery?
I think the private sector has a special place in this world that, just 2 generations ago, we probably didn't have. Global business, because of the internet, we're also connected. The global world is so interdependent now. And it's easier in some ways for businesses to cross national borders than it is for governments. And so I think we need to recognize that we do have special responsibilities on these broader social issues. We give a great deal of thought to the racial equity issues in the United States, housing affordability, and we've set up some innovative programs to actually fund work there. In the Puget Sound area, we set up a $500 million fund, not just subsidized housing, but to try to create a new dynamic in the creation of housing near mass transit centers in ways that make it affordable. It's important that teachers and firefighters and police officers can afford to live in the communities that they serve. Also, we set up a $1 billion carbon investment fund to make investments in projects that will produce green energy and remove carbon from the environment. And those are kind of projects that I think the private sector has special skills at. It's important that we find ways to partner with governments. And governments are actually quite interested in finding ways to de-risk these investments so they increase them. And so I think there's some really interesting synergies with how governments and private sector can work together on addressing these problems.
John Frank, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for talking to me today. I really appreciated it. And of course, you can head to gzeromedia.com/global stage to learn more about our upcoming programming. We've got live streams, video interviews like this one, a podcast series coming up. Stay tuned for that. I'm Tony Masilis. Thanks for watching.